My name is Troy Stanger, and I'm the Senior Director for Congressional Affairs and Trade here. I'm sure, as you all know, circumstances have changed. We were originally scheduled to do a prelude to the summit event. The summit has now been postponed due to the ongoing outbreak of Middle East respiratory syndrome in South Korea. But we wanted to go ahead and talk about the situation that's going on and about the future of the alliance and the future of the summit. Just very briefly, what I will do is I just want to sort of put the context in place. There was a New York Times story this morning, which according to it says that there are 108 confirmed cases of MERS in South Korea. There have been 9 deaths to date. There are approximately 2,900 people who are currently in isolation as a result of it being determined that they were potentially within contact of people who had been exposed. And there are approximately 2,200 schools which have been shut down. To talk about all these issues, and I do want to preface it with the fact that none of us are medical professionals, so this will all be a policy perspective look at things. But we're fortunate that all of our speakers are able to be here this morning. Congressman Salmon, who was hoping to be here, unfortunately due to the congressional schedule, and as I'm sure you all know, Trade Promotion Authority is coming up soon, is not. But we have Evans Revere, and I'll be very brief as you all have the bios, who is currently with the Brookings Institution as a non-resident senior fellow and formerly served both at our embassy in Seoul and has the principal deputy assistant secretary at the Department of State for East Asia and the Pacific. We have Tammy Overby, who is next to him, who is currently the senior vice president for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and served at, led AmCham in Korea and oversaw much of our efforts for the Chorus FTA. And then we have General John Tillelly, who was the former commander of U.S. Forces Korea, UN Command Korea, and one other command post, what's the third hat? I'm forgetting. The ROK, U.S. Combined Forces.
The CFC, which is the most important one.
Yeah. But so with that, I would just like to start off, what, are the initial impressions you have of, what's going on in South Korea?
Well, sort of good news, bad news. The bad news, obviously, is familiar to all of you, is contained in some of the numbers that you just shared with us. First, let me just say that I'm delighted to be here. Wish the circumstances could be a little bit more positive and happier, but we are what we are. As I said, it's a bad news, good news situation. The bad news is, as has been described in all the media this morning, that the situation continues. The number of cases seems to be ticking up slightly every day. Tragic deaths as a result of this disease. There are apparently, according to the ROK's own admission, its own health minister's admission, the system failed in the initial days and weeks of the outbreak of this disease. The quarantine system, the oversight system, the ability to isolate possible victims of this disease, none of those things happened in a timely fashion, bringing about the situation that we have now. So that's all the bad news, and there's probably more. But the good news is that the number of cases that have come up of new cases of MERS, all of those cases are coming from within the population of quarantined patients. And so that is an important step to trying to isolate the disease, get it under control, and perhaps begin to start to roll things back. So the fact that any new case that has been discovered in the last few days or so has come up within this isolated population means that they seem to have some measure of control over things. I think it's unfortunate that President Park is not able to visit, but I certainly understand that this is a critical priority, a critical national priority for her. But that's sort of my just off the top of my head take on where we stand right now.
Well, yeah, and I mean, as I'm sure we all remember, President Obama had to cancel a trip a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So
sure, there's plenty of precedent for this.
Yeah. I guess so that leads to another question. I mean, originally we were going to talk about the alliance and everything. So from the perspective of that, what can the United States do in this situation to help?
You on this as well, but we have a pretty high level of expertise in dealing with communicable diseases, and we have the CDC and other organizations that have tremendous capabilities in this regard. I suspect there already is a lot of cooperation happening. There's very substantial. Is my mic not working?
Apparently not. Sorry.
All right.
It's on.
I'm from the streets of Brooklyn, New York. I've never been afraid of being loud. But there is some impressive expertise that the United States has and can offer, and I'm sure is already offering. And so that's one thing, I think, right at the top of the list. I noticed in the New York Times this morning there was a story about a single patient who had come into the United States, apparently through Chicago from India, and apparently has drug-resistant tuberculosis. And the CDC is all over that. So the CDC knows how to work these issues. The American medical expertise is pretty considerable in this regard. And so if it hasn't already been offered, and I think it probably has been, that's something that the United States could do. Others may have other thoughts on this.
Thank you. I actually think the CDC is on the ground there now. Speaking to the American business community in Seoul, they're very confident that the Korean officials have control of it now. My sister and my brother-in-law live in Seoul. They're parents of a 12 and a 13-year-old, and they are writing notes to the principal, please don't cancel school. Our children need the full education, and you should translate into, we're not ready to have them all summer yet. But they don't believe that their children are at risk, so for what it's worth.
I think, on this situation, it's clear that, our thoughts go out to everyone who's been impacted on this. And, I'm sure everyone in the administration in the United States wants to do what they can to help. One last related question to all of this is, it was announced that the summit has been postponed, so it will be rescheduled. Is there anything we can look to perhaps give us an idea of when we might see this meeting happen?
Presidential schedules are incredibly tight and very difficult to get onto. The U.S. Chamber just went through this exercise with Indonesian President Jokowi. He was supposed to be here in early June. The earliest date the administration and the Indonesian government were able to agree on is October 27th. Our two leaders will see one another at multiple events coming up. They will see one another in Turkey. They will see one another again in New York at the UNGA. And of course, we have APEC in the Philippines in November. So when President Park will come back to the U.S., a lot of smart people are going to be working very hard to try to make that happen. But no, my crystal ball is very blank at the moment.
Let me just offer one more thought on that. I agree with all of that. I would also suggest that if you look at the agenda that people were looking forward to at this summit, talking about North Korea, the rising threat from North Korea, talking about managing relations with China, talking about managing relations between our two critical allies in East Asia, Korea and Japan, and the whole host of other things that were on the plate for discussion. These are all hot issues, and so I'm absolutely sure that it will be a top priority for both capitals to get this meeting scheduled as soon as possible.
Well, that's a good segue. Originally, when we had scheduled this event, the idea was to take and sort of talk about where the alliance is, what might happen at the summit, and where we are going forward. So let's maybe sort of shift now to that direction. General Tillelli, in the last few months, we've seen a number of reports indicating that North Korea is expanding both its nuclear weapons program and its ability to deliver those weapons, such as the SLBM capability. How is the threat that North Korea poses to the United States and South Korea changing?
Well, in a real sense, I mean, and there's certainly experts out in the audience who are better than I. Can you hear me, or do you need the microphone? Can you hear me okay? There are experts in the audience like Stanley Roth out there and others who know better than I. But the fact is that this is not old news. We can trace it back over time, and the trend, if you will, over time is that North Korea has increased their weapons capability. They've increased technologically. They've had a nuclear program that has moved forward to the point now where it's almost fully developed. They've got a missile program that started out with the Taepodong in 1998. They now have SLBMs, or at least a prototypical SLBM, if we can believe what we've seen in the press. They also have mobile launchers. So the threat has gotten more technologically, if you will, better over time. So the consequence of that is that the ROK-US alliance has to be stronger. They have to, in a real sense, look at what are the counter mechanisms that they require in order to defend the peninsula, defend the ROK, and in a real sense, at the same time, move in a diplomatic way to try to have North Korea become part of the global community and, for lack of a better descriptive, dismantle their nuclear program, which I believe is almost an impossible task. So in that context, we've got a threat ahead. We've got a technologically threat that's moving forward, and we don't have a way ahead to stifle it at this point.
Well, General, one of the specific issues that's come up a lot recently in discussion in terms of deterring that threat is the question of THAAD, the Thermal High Altitude Air Defense System. How would better missile defense, help in taking both deterring North Korea, but also, protecting South Korea from a potential attack as well?
The essence of the alliance, and not to go back, is one, peace and stability on the peninsula. Secondly, peaceful reunification. So in a real sense, what is that? And there's a lot of different anecdotal information on what is that. That is a defensive system. That is a missile defensive system. And it really is up to the ROK and US to decide whether or not that is the right defensive system for the peninsula. But be that as it may, there's a larger issue, and that's an integrated missile defense within the region to protect not only the ROK, but the regional partners in the region. And in that context, that ought to be the direction we're going into. When you think about it, it's not only that, it's radars, it's Aegis, it's other systems that allow us not only to provide that deterrent capability, peace and stability on the peninsula, and oh, by the way, protect the ROK in the event of crisis. As we sit here today, and I mean, it's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, as we sit here today, North Korea is not sitting on their hands. They're continuing to develop programs that are intended for either supremacy on the peninsula from the standpoint of military supremacy, or to use their weapon systems to either deter or cause crisis in other parts of the region or the United States.
Now, I know you want to comment, but just to sort of segue into what the General was saying, North Korea isn't standing still. How successful they are in some of these advancements, we can debate. So what types of steps should we be taking?
Let me build on the General's excellent points about where North Korea is and where it's going. My concern is not only what's happening in the Korean Peninsula and on and around the Korean Peninsula, but beyond. And if you look at the capabilities that the North Koreans are developing, if you look at their medium-range ballistic missiles, longer-range ballistic missiles, the mobile systems, etc., warhead miniaturization, in the not-too-distant future, the North Koreans will have the capability, and to some extent may already have a limited capability in this area, to strike just about any regional target in the Western Pacific with their nuclear weapons. North Korea is the only country on planet Earth today, in this century or the last, to have actually threatened to use nuclear weapons. So that, to me, is a statement of intention. We also have indications of growing capabilities in this regard. The North Koreans have made no bones about the fact that they are developing these systems and these capabilities for possible offensive use. And I think we need to take that seriously. And as you look at where the North Koreans are and where they will be in, let's say, 6 months or a year or 2 years out, once they develop that capability, once they are able to demonstrate that they have now perfected warhead miniaturization, marrying the warhead with these systems, and the ability to target or deliver a weapon in a particular area, I think it's going to create a fundamental shift in the regional security environment in Northeast Asia and beyond. Beyond that, I think it's going to raise questions in Seoul and Tokyo and elsewhere about the credibility of the U.S. deterrent. I think we have a good response to that, but the fact is that questions will arise. I think that you'll see some voices, perhaps in Seoul and Tokyo and elsewhere, calling for these countries to develop their own nuclear weapons. And I think it'll be extremely important for the United States to reinforce with our allies and partners that our deterrent will remain in place and will be as credible and as assured as it always has been. But I think the environment's going to change significantly. And I think for those reasons, plus the ones that the General mentioned, I think it's about time for us to think seriously about a pretty significant reorientation of the way that we deal with North Korea. Some have called for a policy review. Some have called for us to emphasize diplomacy. I'm not saying that diplomacy is off the cards, but I think it's important for us to realize that there is a clear and present and growing danger emanating from North Korea, and that we need to take a series of steps designed to compel the North Koreans to come back to the negotiating table, to put their nukes on the table, and to seriously focus on denuclearization. And if we have time, I can go into what some of those steps are. But at a minimum, looking at the experience that we've had dealing with the North Koreans over the years, what is very clear is that the package of steps that we have in place now, the measures that we have in place now, the sanctions, the pressures, et cetera, have not been sufficient to bring North Korea back to the table to engage with us seriously on denuclearization. And one of the suggestions that I've been making recently, including in a briefing earlier this week with senior people from the administration, is we need to put at risk the one thing that the DPRK values, which is the existence of their regime. One of the messages that we have to send to the North Koreans is that if you continue down this path, not only will Byongjin, your joint nuclear and economic development program, fail, but it has the potential to destabilize your regime. And we need to take steps that will reinforce that. I'm not calling for regime change, but I am calling for us to send a very clear message to Pyongyang that there are other things that we can do well above and beyond what we've done already that will make them feel a level of pain, and that level of pain perhaps will be what it takes to bring them back to the table.
Well, there's a series of things for me that come out of this. One, just to go back to the question of them being able to demonstrate what they can do, and also the deterrent. So, I'm not a missile expert, but one of the things I've read is that the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War would test missiles hundreds of times to make sure they worked, and you had very extensive testing and everything. But North Korea clearly is not taking that path. So, General Tilley, I'm somewhat curious. How, from a military perspective, should we view what North Korea is claiming to have achieved? Should we have a grain of salt, or should we, for the sake of preparedness, view it as, yes, they can do it, and we've seen some of this perhaps coming out?
Well, I think you almost have to look at it in categories. Certainly, the ICBM threat is not the only threat that they have. They have missile capability and rocket capability that's very serious, very well developed, and in my mind's eye, very threatening. Secondly, they don't, and they have not had a history of doing extraordinary testing and going through a long developmental cycle. Their history has been test it once, if it works, put it operational. And in that context, and this is somewhat flippant, if only 20% of them work, that's 20% of something very serious and a serious threat against the alliance and against the region. So in that context, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, I think that's just their methodology. I think also hearkening back to something that Mr. Revere said, and in a real sense, I look at intent, spirit and intent. North Korea has declared itself a nuclear state. Do we really think that they are bluffing, or do we think that they're moving forward? And I think everything that's been said, they're moving forward. So in that context, when you look at deterrence and defense, we've got to prepare the alliance for what I believe the what-if drill. The what-if drill is probably the worst case.
One other thing, Evans, that you had mentioned, which I'd like to draw out, and maybe you and General Tolele both have thoughts on this, is the question of the credibility of the U.S. deterrent, specifically the nuclear umbrella. And one of the things that has perplexed me is, we didn't seem to have these credibility issues during the Cold War when the Soviet Union had thousands of nuclear weapons. Now, whether you believe North Korea has less than 20, whether they're going to have 100, why does it seem as though the credibility of the nuclear umbrella is not seen as strong as it was in the Cold War?
Well, I think it is seen as fairly strong in both Tokyo and Seoul. My point is that when you have North Korea continuing down the path that it's continuing, and once again, I'm not making a point about the lack of will or determination or capability of this U.S. administration or any of the previous U.S. administrations. We've made a tremendous effort over 4 U.S. administrations to get these threats under control. The bottom line is that all of those efforts, despite the best efforts of 4 U.S. administrations, we have failed to stop North Korea's nuclear weapons development. And so the fact that you now have a new player on the block, a new player with the intentions that we have already discussed here, which are very, very serious and very threatening and very ominous, these new capabilities, which does not subscribe, as far as we know, to any of the normal protocols for the control of nuclear weapons, or the management of nuclear weapons, or any of the normal protocols that any of the other nuclear weapons states subscribes to in terms of controlling those weapons and a philosophy of use, et cetera. When you have that threat out there, and it's not just a threat on the horizon anymore, it's a real threat, it raises questions. It's bound to raise questions about U.S. determination. And so that's the reason I made the point that when the North Koreans do demonstrate these new capabilities and demonstrate for us, as I'm sure they will at some point, that they have these capabilities, it's going to raise these questions, and we are going to need to have the right answers.
I would say one other thing, because I think you're exactly right. I think our nuclear umbrella deterrent is very strong. But the strength of the alliance is not only in one weapon system or one nuclear umbrella. The strength of the alliance is the people who are sitting in this room and sitting outside of this room in America who are willing to send their children, men and women, to the Republic of Korea to defend the Republic of Korea in the case of crisis. And that commitment is made. It's been made for since the Korean War, and it's stronger now than it's ever been. So in that context, it's not only the nuclear umbrella, and we talk about that a lot, and you have opposition who say we should develop, others that say we shouldn't develop, but you have to look at it as the alliance in context. And what is the purpose of the alliance? And the purpose of the alliance is what it has been and what it will be in the future. This is a model alliance, it's a strong alliance, and in my mind's eye, it gets stronger every day.
And I think this is a really good point. I mean, this is an alliance, a relationship, a partnership, whatever term we want to use, that has become much more encompassing, especially over the last 10 years or so. And it has a significant dimension just simply beyond, as you say, a weapon system or specifically the deterrent against North Korea. With that in mind, Tammy, one of the significant parts of this relationship now is the US-Korea FTA. Especially now that we have the debate going on in Congress over TPP and TPA, there's been a lot of discussion, of course, on whether it has been successful, and critics have argued it hasn't been. What is the case, or what from the business community's perspective, how has it worked?
That's a great question. I think 3 years is too soon to determine the success of a free trade agreement. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the US-Australia FTA, and we have doubled our trade with Australia in that decade. The products covered under the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, we have certainly seen an increase in exports. The rules system that Chorus sets up are working very well. We have 19 different committees and working groups that allow us to raise issues at a high level on a very regularized basis. That's been very successful in helping us resolve the inevitable and expected problems that are going to come up. we have a large, over $100 billion two-way trade relationship with South Korea. Of course, we're going to have bumps in the road. That was expected. I think some of the opponents expect a perfect trade deal, that once you sign this, we flip a switch and everything works perfectly. That's not how trade agreements work. It takes time to reorient government officials on what the new rules are. And sometimes we have to go back and clarify our understandings. But I think that both the Korean government officials and certainly our friends at USTR have done an outstanding job at doing that. We are making progress. But to the critics who say it's a failure, I believe it's a very unfair criticism. And I challenge them to meet me on a stage in 7 more years so I can do my happy dance. I told you so. Mark your calendars.
I want to see that, Tammy.
It's ugly, sir. It's ugly.
My instinct is they're more worried about their dance now and not worrying about the long term.
Yes.
But that leads then, if you don't mind me sort of digressing for a second, we do have this debate now going on in the United States on whether the president should have trade promotion authority. There is discussion that the House may bring it up this week. What do you see as the prospects for the president being granted TPA, and what are the prospects for TPP going forward?
I see absolute success, and I say that because, forgive me for just checking my email, but my phone's blowing up, and it's blowing up because House Majority Leader McCarthy and Speaker Boehner have said they expect it to come up, TPA to come up this week. I'm looking at the reasons that the opponents of trade are using in these arguments, and they're getting pretty desperate when they're talking. First of all, they say it's a secret agreement. And then in their very next breath, they say, but it's a bad agreement. Well, if it's a secret agreement, how do you know it's bad? Okay, so we'll start with that. But, let's say that some of the information is public. WikiLeaks is out there. They're being criticized for labor and the environment. I have no doubt in my mind that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will have the absolute highest labor standards and environmental standards in any trade agreement ever. Frankly, the way the U.S. government does trade agreements, they build on previous ones. That's why the Chorus Free Trade Agreement, which is currently the gold standard agreement in force, it learned from NAFTA. It learned from the U.S.-Australia agreement, and we build on. So when the negotiators went in for TPP, these on labor and environment, these will be binding requirements. So I really think the opponents either haven't taken the time to learn the facts, or frankly, they don't care about the facts. They just want to kill the deal. But I believe when you see, I am so pleased that President Obama and his full government, full administration is out there speaking, and I believe in very clear and direct terms that the Trans-Pacific Partnership will set the standards for trade in Asia. It's going to give American farmers, businesses, and our services a more level playing field. And as President Obama said in his State of the Union this year, if the U.S. doesn't set these rules, other countries will, and it won't be good for America. I think that's absolutely true. So I believe that we will get TPA very soon. And on the TPP negotiations, we're well into 5 years of negotiations. And having gone to many of these rounds and spent a lot of time with the other countries' chief negotiators, as well as Barbara and Wiesel and Wendy Cutler, I can tell you we are almost there. Now, it's not going to be a perfect agreement. And by that I mean Japan is not going to zero in every agriculture line. But you know what? Neither are we. We're not going to zero in sugars, footwear, apparel. Every country has some sacred cows. So, but what we are going to see, and Wendy Cutler, who's been negotiating with the Japanese for over 25 years, says she can't believe how much meaningful commercial access we are going to get from this agreement. So, to the opponents, I would argue that they need to spend more time actually talking to the people who know. That would be the negotiators and to the business community. While we're not in the negotiations, TPP and TPA have consumed my life. And in a good way, because what we're doing is really going to make a huge difference for America and for Asia. And the reason our colleagues in Europe and TTIP, the transatlantic investment partnership, is they're following TPP so closely because once we're done with TPP, that's going to give the energy for TTIP to move. And oh, by the way, the Chinese are watching very closely. They went from saying TPP was a bad thing, that it was all about containing China, to now they're following it very closely, and at an appropriate time, I expect they will want to join. Now, in all of our discussions with them, we're saying, yes, we want you to join at the same high level as everyone else. Their next response is, oh, but the standards are too high. To which I reply, but the Vietnamese can do it, certainly a great nation like China. And then they usually say, more alcohol, more alcohol. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, speaking of countries wanting to join TPP, Korea has expressed interest in joining. What does Korea need to do to join the TPP, and what scenarios do you see in terms of them potentially joining?
Well, Korea absolutely should be a part of TPP as soon as that can be made possible. Right now, the 12 parties have agreed that the focus is on getting the deal done, so no new countries will join the first tranche. But South Korea is well positioned to be a leader in the second tranche. I think there will be, the pathway for new countries to dock into TPP has not been finalized and made public. But if you talk privately to some negotiators, they'll say, look at the way Japan joined. There was a pre-negotiation and then a parallel negotiation. I think I've already heard some countries saying, oh yeah, when Korea or the Philippines or China, when they join, we look forward to having a pre-negotiation and a parallel negotiation. And again, the pre-negotiation is to show that you have the political will to do these very difficult things. And the parallel negotiation is if you think that there are things that are not covered in TPP, because it doesn't cover everything, that you need to negotiate on, you can do a parallel, as we've done with Japan, on autos and agriculture.
So one other thing that I'd like to ask you is, we often view the economic relationship with Korea through the lens of either chorus or, basically bilateral trade issues. But it actually extends much more beyond that. Korea has worked with us on revising the ITA. They did a lot of work, especially when they were chair of the G20, on financial issues. How would you assess multilateral economic cooperation with Korea?
I think it's really good, and I think that's where Korea can be a big player. And one of the strongest reasons I want Korea in chorus, or in TPP, excuse me, is because they already have high standards in environment, in protecting intellectual property rights, in labor. And in the multilateral context and expanding ITA, yes, these are areas where we can and must work together. It was interesting to watch in Asia where Japan sat back and let Korea, Korea, they were so forward-leaning in trade agreements. They have FTAs, I think, with 10 of the 12 countries in TPP. They don't with Japan, and I forget who the other one is. But they need to be in it for geostrategic reasons, and also because, just for preferential reasons. This is an agreement that benefits the companies that are manufacturing or operating within these 12 jurisdictions. Koreans have a lot of investment in these 12 countries already. Why shouldn't Korean companies benefit?
Well, Evan, speaking of regional, at least, economic issues, one that's been controversial has been the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and specifically, allies such as, Korea joining the bank. There was a lot of consternation. How do you see this, going forward, and could the participation of countries like Korea in the AIIB really, help lead towards U.S. participation in the future?
Good question. I think it's important for Korea and a number of other U.S. allies and partners who are in now to play the role that puts at ease a lot of the concerns that the United States had as we were looking at possible membership in AIIB, but also the same concerns that were shared by all those countries, including the ROK and Japan and others. And so I think it's going to be a work in progress as the members, as they exist now, work to ensure that this new international institution is transparent, that it operates according to the agreed upon rules of the road that other significant international financial institutions operate under, that it is not dominated by any one party, and that it is open to the ideas and recommendations and concerns of all of the players, both the founding members and others who will add their participation later on. And if they are successful in doing that, in ensuring that this is the sort of organization that the United States feels comfortable with, I can envision the United States at some point down the road joining. I think, speaking very frankly and personally, I think it was a lost opportunity for us not to get in on the ground floor for precisely the reasons I just mentioned. If you have these concerns and if you realize that this is going to be a new organization, it's going to happen, you want to be in on the ground floor to make sure it operates in the way that deals with all your concerns. So I think it's a missed opportunity, but it's certainly not the last opportunity, and I'm hoping at some point down the road the United States can find its way towards participating in it.
Troy, on that, I completely agree with Evan. In addition, one ASEAN ambassador said to me that if the U.S. tries to force a choice among Asian nations between the U.S. and China, the result will be the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank example, where 57 countries have joined. I think also, even if the administration had aggressively wanted to join, we would have had a challenge with Congress. I think Congress, I don't even believe we're funding the IMF right now. So, but I do think it's important that and again, I'm delighted Korea, Australia, and many of our friends are in the AIIB so that they can help promote transparency, good corporate governance, and open procurement. We very much want American companies to be able to participate in AIIB funding. We all know that infrastructure in Asia, there's a huge appetite. We're talking over $1 trillion. They need money. Our Japanese friends, Japan has also not joined. They announced recently $100 billion together. They want to work with the ADB on infrastructure. So, I think the more money that countries can put towards infrastructure in Asia and in a framework where there's open procurement, good governance, and transparency, we all win.
To sort of keep with the theme of broader cooperation, both regionally and globally, General Tully, Korea has taken part in the anti-piracy missions off the coast of Somalia. Korea has been one of our most consistent partners in terms of peacekeeping. What types of broader military operations can the two countries, or should the two countries be working on outside either the Korean Peninsula and the region or more broadly globally?
First, let me put it in a historical context. I think it's very important to understand that the Republic of Korea, when the United States has been involved in any crisis, the Republic of Korea has contributed either forces or other, if you will, other means to help the United States. Afghanistan, Iraq, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, they've been there. Been a humanitarian contribution or, in fact, a force contribution. So in that context, when you think about this alliance has been an alliance that has gone hand in hand in just about everything that you can think of in a real sense. So what's in the future? I think if I were to look at a crystal ball, I would say there are a number of things. One, freedom of navigation is one that we all are concerned about. And how would the Republic of Korea and the United States of America, in a collaborative way, help pursue freedom of navigation, which for the Republic of Korea and the United States are very critical. Secondly, when you look at other opportunities for peacekeeping, or if you want to use a term which is not in vogue, nation building, helping nations around the world lift themselves up, where the United States and the Republic of Korea could help in a collaborative way. I think that's another area. Also, and we've seen this when you think about it in the military context, and I'll put myself in the military context, when you think about combined exercises where we are working with friends and allies and other countries who want to, for lack of a better descriptive, build their militaries. Because when you look at the Republic of Korea military, it's a democratic military, it's highly led, it's tremendously equipped, it's got great soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. As you look at that military, how does any country in a democracy build that military to be the same, if you were, a model or an analog? So the United States and the Republic of Korea can be useful in many different ways, and not only in crisis. And I think that's when you ought to look at crisis as the last modality. You want to look at it during the time when there is not crisis, when they can affect, if you will, others to prevent crisis, to deter crisis, to work in a democratic environment.
Well, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I want to take some time for questions, and I see Stanley here has one, so why don't we go ahead, and if everyone just please could identify yourself as well.
And I think you got to the core of the issue on deterrence when you said, basically what we've been doing thus far, hasn't really worked in terms of stopping the program, and you had thoughts on how to increase the pain. Could you address that, but in two contexts? One, the risk associated with what you're proposing, but also responding to the notion that the one thing North Korea seems to value most is survival. You, the General I, anyone who's done Korea policy before, during, or after us have all lived with very serious North Korean threats every time there's a major exercise and numerous other occasions, but they haven't done it, even though they've done some pretty awful things. Do you really think they would risk survival? Do they not understand that in the context of the use of nuclear weapons as opposed to just adding it to their arsenal of usual threats?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. One of my big concerns is there's obviously the potential that they might run that risk. I would say that potential is not as great as some claim for precisely the reasons that you've mentioned. Deterrence is a major factor here, and I think the North Koreans understand that their use of a weapon of mass destruction would result in the end of North Korea. It's simple as that. I think they understand that. I'm a lot more concerned about the intimidation factor, the blackmail factor that possession of nuclear weapons would have, and the fact that, as I said a little bit earlier, it would change the nature of the perceived threat in the region in some fundamental ways and make life a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult for all of us. And I did not raise an issue earlier, and I'll raise it now, the increased potential for proliferation by North Korea. North Korea is not a theoretical proliferator. North Korea has a track record of proliferation. They have worked with Pakistan, they have worked with Libya, they have worked with Syria, and there are some interesting reports that they may even today be working with Iran. That is a tremendous issue of concern to me, particularly as their program becomes a lot more sophisticated, as their economy continues to sort of crawl along. The incentive might be there at some point for the North Koreans to do something on the proliferation area. In terms of what could be done, North Korea has some remarkable vulnerabilities. Their banking system, financial flows into and out of North Korea. Something that we could use as the basis for further steps against North Korea that would really inflict some pain on the regime would be some contemporary version of the Banco Delta Asia sanctions. The irony of Banco Delta Asia was that it worked, and the United States responded to a North Korean nuclear test and a missile test by basically removing the BDA sanctions. There was also a China problem here as well, but too complicated to get into. Financial sanctions, focusing on North Korea's banking system, financial flows. I think there are things that we could do using existing authorities that have been given to the international community by the UN Security Council, but also exist with such mechanisms as the Proliferation Security Initiative to begin to interdict North Korean aircraft and ships that may be suspected of carrying WMD or WMD-related materials. There are things that could be done in the covert realm with respect to North Korea's economy that I think would send a very, very clear message to the North Koreans that we are deadly serious about getting them back into a discussion of denuclearization. Are there risks involved? Yes, there are risks involved. There are risks that are particularly sensitive ones in Seoul. To the extent that we ramp up pressure on North Korea, to the extent that North Korea has the potential to respond violently, the first recipient of a North Korean violent response would almost certainly be the Republic of Korea. That's something that we need to keep very, very carefully in mind moving forward. And that's why it's so important that we have the incredibly transparent, multi-level dialogue with our ROK allies that we do today, and policy is basically set in tandem, and it's important that that happen. So going forward, a lot of steps that we could take. There are some risks that I acknowledge here. There is also the risk that even though our intention might not be to bring about the collapse of North Korea, that the place does begin to unravel, and we need to be prepared for that as well. There have already been Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues about various contingencies that could happen on the Korean Peninsula in the future. But as we look at North Korea and we look at North Korea's future, particularly under the somewhat erratic leadership that it has right now with some very strange things happening inside the North, we need to include in our list of alternate futures the possibility that North Korea could collapse. Are we ready for that? At the government level, I think not.
If I could just hitchhike on that, Stanley, and I think Evans did, in fact, raise the issue. But when you have risks, you better look at the second and third level consequences and be prepared for those consequences no matter what they are. So it really is a dovetail of whatever action you're going to take, how do you prepare? Because when you start squeezing, something is going to pop out, and you don't want miscalculation or crisis on the peninsula pop out. And if that does, you better be ready for it.
Chris.
That's a good quote, so I'm writing it down. Thanks. Squeezing and things pop out. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report, thanks so much for a great discussion. Nice to see everybody. I will confess a relief that President Park isn't coming because it means I take Monday off. But I realize that's just me. A quick question for Tammy, and then why can't we say more on China and regime change? Tammy, the Republican leadership said last Friday that they were going to try to do it this week, and then they said they were going to do a whip count today, they thought, and if things look good, maybe have the vote tomorrow. Are you hearing that on your emails, or are they still just saying this week?
I'm hearing by no later than Friday. They're almost there, and again, I'm fighting every ounce of not to look right now because it could come today or tomorrow.
Yeah. So, okay, great, thanks.
So very soon.
Yeah. Evans, thanks for your as usual, eloquent discussion of the risks. If I'm hearing you correctly, you haven't given up on really increasing the sanctions pressure. Mm-hmm. You're reluctant to say we need to go for regime change. I think we can all understand why, but maybe you should say why. We need to be careful about not saying that now. Then you said China's too complicated to get into. Well, I think as Stanley can tell us from his own experience, you kind of got to get into China because at a certain point you're pushing against a wall that is not there. You know, why is there any confidence in the panel that China is getting ready to be prepared to tolerate or even implement sanctions that would be so painful that the Kim regime would give up its constitutional right to have nuclear weapons? Because if not, we're just delaying the inevitable, aren't we? And maybe we should just start going for regime change. So that questions embedded in speeches. Thanks.
Quickly on regime change, the last time I looked, the United States of America was not very good at doing that. And talk about second and third and fourth order effects of regime changes. Yes, exactly, and that's still being played out in interesting fashions. But the Middle East is a mess, and to be very frank, the Middle East is in part a mess because of failed attempts at regime change, and look at the mess that's been created. Any proactive effort to bring down a regime like the North Korean regime would have powerful effects, many of them negative, on its next door neighbor, our ally, the Republic of Korea. So one treads into that area very, very carefully. Now, there's always the possibility of implosion or collapse or assassination, all sorts of scenarios that all of us have thought through here that bring about the end of the regime. And what I was getting at in my comments earlier is that if any of those things happen, we need to be ready for it. And the last time I looked, and I look very frequently, there's been no formal government-to-government-to-government conversations about what we do in the aftermath of that scenario. On China, my specific comment on China, avoiding getting into the analysis of it, was directed at the BDA issue, because there were some important ramifications for the Chinese banking system that flowed out of BDA. And one of the things that, as a person who participated in this process back in the day, thought of at the time was that there were going to be some knock-on effects of BDA in China, and there were. And the Chinese reacted very badly to it. And so any future sanctions that we look towards imposing on North Korea, particularly ones that relate to financial flows in the banking system, we're going to have to figure out a way that these sanctions are deconflicted with any possible negative effects on the PRC, or we are going to have to make sure that we've had a very intense and thorough conversation with the PRC so that the PRC is on board. Now, one of the greatest drawbacks to the additional measures that I have suggested is Chinese cooperation, which is better than it has been, but nowhere near as good as it should be in terms of dealing with North Korea. There is a lot more that the Chinese could and should be doing. Just a couple of specific areas here. Every time an aircraft, a military aircraft, leaves Sunan Airport or some other North Korean military base and flies to Tehran, or some other base in Iran, it flies through Chinese airspace, and vice versa. What's on those aircraft? What sort of contraband may be on those aircraft? That's a question that we ought to be posing, and I'm sure we have posed to our Chinese friends. I don't know what sort of an answer we're getting, but I'll bet it's not the sort of answer that suggests that the Chinese are prepared to stop those flights from flying back and forth. There are other factors here. At the end of the day, as I said in a meeting in New York a couple of weeks ago, despite all the changes in Chinese policy towards North Korea, despite the increasing frustration that's really palpable in terms of Chinese rhetoric about North Korea, despite the cooling of the relationship, at the end of the day, Beijing still has Pyongyang's back. And that has not changed. And so we need to keep that in mind because it's an important factor. And we need to figure out a way to get the Chinese into a better place on North Korea.
Is there a South Korean role in that?
There's always a South Korean role in this. South Korea enjoys a very good and very close dialogue with the PRC. South Korea has, among all the players, the biggest equity in getting this issue resolved. And it's incumbent on the ROK to make its views known in Beijing, and I'm sure that's already being done.
Yes, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. My name is Junpei Yoshioka from Japanese Public TV NHK. Just wanted to ask three of you about the Korean relationship with Japan, because the Japanese was really focusing on President Park's next week's visit regarding on her stance towards Japanese issues like history and the upcoming Prime Minister's statement on August 15th, but it has been postponed. So what kind of influence will it make? And generally, how do you three of you evaluate from your point of view, like diplomatic influence or from the economic or security point of view? Thank you.
One of the many reasons that I'm disappointed that President Park is not going to be coming here next week is precisely the one that you mentioned, because I was hoping that Japan-ROK relations would be on the agenda. I'm sure it was going to be on the agenda in some way, shape, or form. It gives me tremendous discomfort and frustration as an American, seeing our two major regional allies at each other's throats the way they have been in recent years. There has been a greater effort on the part of both governments to try to move forward and develop a more forward-looking relationship. I think it's extremely positive that the two defense ministers met recently. But certainly the problems, the fundamental problems and the disconnects between Tokyo and Seoul are still there. I think it was unfortunate that Prime Minister Abe missed an opportunity when he came here to the United States to say something definitive. I understand that that was not quite the right environment for him to say what needed to be said, but he could have done so anyway. He'll have other opportunities in the coming weeks to say some things. It's important, I think, for Japan to take some very clear steps, symbolically and practically, to reach out to its neighbors, particularly the ROK, on issues of history and comfort women. But it's equally important, and I tell this to my Korean friends all the time, that when apologies and messages and steps are taken by Japan, to accept them and appreciate them in the spirit in which they've been offered. There's plenty of work for both sides to do in moving forward in this relationship. And I think President Park's visit here could have helped move the ball a little bit here. But we still have some time left. We still have the anniversary on the 22nd. We still have the anniversary on the 15th of August. And there's a lot of time now for the two leaders to reach out to each other in a way that eases my comfort level as a person who loves both countries very dearly.
No, I think that's well said. I think we should not miss whatever opportunity we have to rebuild the bridges, if you will. The fact is, there are two critical allies. We have great affection for both, and not only for stability, but also for the human aspects of it. It should be done, and it should be done as quickly as possible.
Oh, gentleman right here.
Thanks for this great panel discussion. I had a question specifically for General Tillelly, something you mentioned earlier about areas of potential future cooperation between ROK and U.S. militaries. You mentioned they have a shared interest in freedom of navigation. I was wondering if you think South Korea would go so far as to join the chorus that the U.S. is trying to assemble when it comes to South China Sea. Is that a bridge too far for them, or an artificial reef too far for them, as the
You're asking
situation
me
may be?
a hypothetical here on what the Korean reaction would be. In my view, freedom and navigation is a worldwide issue. We shouldn't focus on just one area. We need to focus on it in a global context. And freedom of navigation is as important to the Republic of Korea as the United States, as it is to all nations. And philosophically and strategically, that ought to be the first goal, to figure out how we iron that out. And at the same time, diplomatically solve those other issues that are irritants at this particular point or will become more serious over time. That's my personal view. Whether the Republic of Korea joins the United States on any one direction, I think it's a strategic and global issue rather than a specific issue at a given point in time. The given point in time is what's causing the issue to be raised right now. Evans, I don't know if there's anything else.
All right, well, if there are no other questions, if you'll join me in thanking our panelists. We've had a very enlightening discussion this morning. Hopefully it's